what we thought we would do is, as we were designing this conference this year, is part of the value of this conference, I said earlier, is different perspectives. And rather than just trying to rebuild each time lots of sessions that try to dig too deeply into one dimension, we thought it'd be a good chance to do some takeaways. We've had a busy day already today with 2 plenaries, a keynote speech this morning. We've had 6 breakout sessions on really quite specific targeted issues this afternoon. You've all had to absorb a lot of information. Hopefully you've been delivering lots of good ideas as well. And I thought what we would try and do is get some takeaways. And for our takeaways, I'm delighted that we've got with us 4 great participants who are now panelists for this period of the evening. Immediately on my left, Mina Laraibi, who's editor-in-chief of the national newspaper, which is based out of Abu Dhabi. Mina's very experienced on doing these conferences, and I know she will be able to give us some great insights. She was a senior fellow at the Institute for State Effectiveness, which I think is a particularly important element, given a lot of the subject today has been about the strength of states, their capacity to deliver or not in today's world. Alexei Cherkunkov, delighted he could be with us because, as he will explain in a minute, he's the CEO of a rather large part CEO of an investment part of a very large part of Russia, the Far East and Baikal Region Development Fund, which I'll let him describe how large it is a minute ago, because it took me a little bit by surprise in terms of total space. But if you think of Russia's kind of south and east, it is a vast part of Russia that is looking for economic opportunity, helping to drive growth for Russia, but also connected fascinatingly with developments in China as well. And Alexei, delighted you could be with us here today. He's been also involved prior to that in the Russia-China Investment Fund, and I'm hoping we might be able to talk a little bit therefore about Belt and Road Initiative, which is a phrase you really almost can't go to a conference these days without mentioning it somewhere in the agenda. Pavel Svoboda, on his right as you're looking at the stage, now deputy head of the European Political Strategy Center, which is the sort of in-house think tank for the European Commission. Pavel has been a great friend and colleague. Think tank head, established Demos Europa in Warsaw. After having worked in the Polish Ministry of Foreign Affairs, he was Director General for the EU Department for its relationship with the EU, advisor to the Polish President, very intimately involved at the time in Poland's accession to the EU, so brings some very interesting perspectives from an EU standpoint. And then Joe Liao, who's Dean now of the S. Rajaratnam School of International Studies, Nanyang Technological University in Singapore, but the Rajaratnam School is one of the great think tanks in Southeast Asia, but he's also worked at Brookings and is an expert both on America's role in Southeast Asia, but also done a lot of work on Muslim politics in that part of the world. And as we've had a lot of discussion today about some of these sub-national drivers of change, I think, Joe, you'll be able to bring some extra interesting perspectives there as well. But we thought what I would do to start with, and I will try to give a good 35 minutes at least to get viewpoints from all of you around the table, your main takeaways as well. I thought we'd just start a little bit with some questions about this morning's, the first session on US leadership. I mean, if you want to talk about the Foreign Secretary's intervention, his speech on non-proliferation and so on, I'll definitely let you do that. But let me just go straight into the first panel we had there about America First, America Alone. I'm struck by the difference in language at the moment between an America that's proclaiming America First and China that's talking about win-win cooperation. You know, the comment was made on that opening panel, is China getting the soft power argument better today than America? Is this just momentary? Is it better spin? Who knows? But Mina, as you sit in the Middle East, and there does seem to be a bit of a competition at the moment, I would say, between China and the United States for influence in the Middle East, and maybe also leaderships there, in the Gulf in particular, reaching out to both sets of countries and going to Moscow a fair amount as well, trying to play the big powers off each other. Who do you think's getting the message right or better at the moment? How does it look from your part of the world?
Thank you, Robin. It's great to be here. For us, the relationship with the United States really shifted during the Obama presidency. And so actually the Trump administration in some ways feels more honest, because while the messaging and the rhetorical speeches are different with Trump, it feels that it's more transactional, which, to be honest, quite often in the region, especially for the countries that have vast wealth, have felt that that's the way it is, that there are national interests and who's pursuing their national interest. So it's a different tone from Washington that people actually can trust more, because all that talk about, your interests are our interests and we're all in this together wasn't really the case. And we saw that happen on multiple levels, and we can talk about at length when it comes to the American administration.
So that's a really interesting place to start off. In a way, you're saying the transactionalism, which so many in the West criticize Trump for, sitting in the Middle East, at least it feels that you're being realistic.
Yeah.
What did we really get out of the speeches before? I'm interpreting what you're saying here. But therefore, at least you kind of know where you stand, and you're interested in what America can deliver. And if the gap between rhetoric and delivery is close, then that's good. And maybe you can handle transactional.
Yeah, because the Obama administration started with that beautiful Cairo speech of 2009, and people still hark back to it.
Yep.
But very little actually happened from that speech. And that's not to excuse some of the actions of the Trump administration, but exactly as you were saying, it feels more realistic. And when it comes to China, people also don't see the Chinese trying to export their way of life. And so there is an understanding that, again, this could be where do our interests meet. But the US stays more vital for the Middle East region, in large part because of security. The bases that are there, the arms deals, but also in terms of strategic issues that comes to Iran, for example, when it comes for not only the Gulf, but where will Iraq, Syria, Yemen fall out when it comes to this struggle with Iran. So it's a different dynamic than Europe, I can say for sure.
But a very interesting point. Well, but before we go to Europe or to Russia, let me go right over to the end. Joe, rhetoric versus realism, one of the signature early offers of the Obama administration was the pivot to Asia, away from the Middle East, more than Europe perhaps. And here we are now with the Trump administration that has abandoned the Trans-Pacific Partnership. I'm not sure whether the security commitments, sometimes they're made in very belligerent tone about the South China Sea and keeping China out of there, but other moments it's very transactional. South Korea, we may or may not back you, depending on whether you trade well with us or not. Again, to Mina's point about realism versus rhetoric, do you think this is going to be a more transparent realism about America's real influence in the region, or are you guys quite worried from a Singaporean ASEAN perspective?
Well, I think not just Singapore, but the rest of the region, we're pretty realistic in terms of how we view the Trump administration. As to whether we are talking about continuity or change from the pivot, I think it depends on how you pass it. If you look at the trade side of the ledger, it's quite clear that it has been quite significant, the change. More disconcerting, I think, is the fact that there doesn't appear to be a plan B if we consider the TPP as the plan A. We haven't seen plan B yet, so we're waiting for some signals to that effect. On the security side of the ledger, you're absolutely right by implying that there has actually been an uptick of American interest and American presence in the region. For example, if you just consider the number of ship hours that the US Navy is going to deploy this year in the South China Sea, it's an increase from the Obama administration. But where the concern lies is whether or not all this activity is guided by any sense of a strategy towards the region. I think the jury is still out on that count. Over and above that, there is another somewhat discomfiting scenario today, and that is the fact that while there has been a string of cabinet-level visits to my part of the world, Southeast Asia, and indeed the president himself will be making a trip next month, what is absent is the very active engagement by sub-cabinet officials that we saw during the Obama administration, which is quite absent today. And that makes it very difficult for us to have any sort of substantive follow-up on the grand statements by the James Mattis or by Tillerson or indeed by the president himself.
And part of the problem is, if I'm right in saying it, there aren't those sub-cabinet ministers. So it's not they're not coming, they don't exist at the moment.
No, exactly.
And which, again, tells you tells you something. But let me just contrast it quickly, as I did with Mina, with the China angle. I mean, we have the 19th Party Congress taking place today. These are the last 2 days, actually, today and tomorrow, which is partly why it's quite complicated getting Chinese participation this year for this year's London conference. But it's not going to stop us talking about China. In contrast, do you see China applying a strategy? Do you think the countries of Southeast Asia feel that there is a new order emerging in their part of the world, or not?
Yes, I think so. I mean, if you take collectively Xi Jinping's speech at Davos, his speech at the opening of the Belt Road Initiative, and his speech at the opening of the Party Congress, you put it all together, this government in Beijing, the Xi Jinping administration, has a very clear sense of what they want to achieve and how they intend to achieve it. Whether they will or not, that is debatable. But certainly, it's a pretty clear sense. So the days of Deng Xiaoping's what was it?
Bide your time
and lay low. I think those days are well and truly gone.
And I'm coming now back this way. Let's come to Europe now, Pavel. Angela Merkel famously said, you know, we're going to have to take care more of ourselves. Britain's sort of drifting into a period of uncertainty at the very best. The United States trying to bring the same transactionalism to a part of the world, Europe, that felt it was based more on the values. So as we look at the kind of this moment, Macron coming into the Élysée, what seems to be a relaunch of ideas about deeper European integration, and particularly around security, is this a moment of concern, or do you think Europe's going to be the leader of an example that, look, we'll take some more of the burden from the United States. We can't rely on you as much as we did. We know it. We're going to do something about it. What do you think?
Well, we definitely need to clear the air with our American allies, who definitely remain allies, and their contribution to European security remains vital. Nevertheless, we do have a different vision as to the world order. And what I find most problematic now in the US approach is that the attractiveness of the US model as a democracy, as a liberal democratic country, that attractiveness has diminished significantly to the extent to which the US does not have the same influence in the world as it used to have. And that is troubling for us because, of course, Europe would like to see the world as an XL version of itself. Its natural vision of the world is that of a multilateralist design and order, which would basically be an extension of what happened here on this continent after the war. And of course, things are not that easy any longer, and they are more complicated with the current US administration. But you're right that what happens in the US, and if I may say so, what happens in the UK, translates into a lot of new type of activism in Europe, and in particular in the area of security and defense, where we have not really done that much for the past 60 years. It was a hopeful project in the 1950s, but then abandoned by the French themselves. And now in the past 12 months, we have seen more action than in those 60 years. It's still mostly on paper, so the jury is out what is going to come out of it. But some of the projects are pretty tangible. The European Defense Fund, for example, will be the biggest player in Europe when it comes to research and development. So these are pretty meaningful plans which are being developed. So we are doing a little bit of a reset. But going back to the morning session, there was a lot of talk about exhaustion of the United States, which I found very interesting. The US has engaged so much in the world and has done all of us so much good that now it needs to take a break. Well, I mean, I understand where this comes from, but we should look at things in broader terms. Not only to say that not all the US engagement has been a force of good, on the one hand, but on the other, it's not only the military engagement that counts. I mean, Europe is a much bigger spender when it comes to development aid and humanitarian assistance. So if you would put everything together, then I think our equation would look much more balanced than is often assumed.
Let me just follow up on one point on this. You said that the attractiveness of the US model as a democracy has maybe diminished a bit, but the attractiveness of the language that Donald Trump has used in order to get elected and to keep his base warm seems to be quite appealing to some governments within the European Union. So are you at all worried, as you look in particular parts of Central and Eastern Europe, as Central East European members of the EU, also some parties within the West, there is an attractiveness within the UK, France, even Germany, of that more atavistic kind of feeling of nationhood, what it should be, and a slight disdain for some of the structures of liberal order, whether it be the free press, the judiciary. Are you worried that the way the language in America is actually penetrating inside Europe, rather than it just being an impact on its neighborhood?
I think what the US is doing doesn't necessarily help to maintain the high standards of rule of law and governance in parts of Europe as well, because everyone can say, well, look at what's going on in the US. So that frame of comparison that frame of reference is not there any longer. But having said this, I think the difficulties in Central Europe have a very different reason for them. I would trace them more to identity issues. I think Central Europe had this imposed identity in the pre-'89 period for obvious reasons. But then it lived on borrowed identity as it joined NATO and the European Union, because these clubs were already shaped and formed. These countries were joining projects which had already been established. So now it's a more introverted period when they try to look into themselves and try to define their own true national identity, try to find their spot under the sun. Mm-hmm. So that's how I would read it. The methods seem to be quite similar to those of Mr. Trump, but I think countries of the region are coming from a different direction.
Alexei, I'm happy for you to make any comments you want on US leadership and so on, though I think part of the value of having you on this panel is another theme that's been emerging from here, which is whether states really can deliver the change that their citizens want or not, whether in America or in Europe or in other parts of the world, and whether regions, cities, cross-regional and intra-city networks are becoming almost more important today to world order than they were before. And you're leading the development of a vast part of Russia, for which China and what it does and how you're connecting with it will be incredibly important. We wanted to do some work on cities here. There's a big Bloomberg conference going on of mayors at the moment, but we're very glad that you'd be here. Could you say, when you look at China, do you see this as opportunity? Is it really a case of is it Beijing and Moscow working on these big new interconnections between China and Russia? Or is it more people like you, businesses? Is it at a different level? What can we learn from your experience?
Thank you, Robin, for the opportunity to be here. I think a lot of predicaments that were discussed today have to do with short-termism of policy, with the electoral cycle, and with the need for politicians to keep in mind this very intense, very short-term waves, like surfers who have to take the latest wave if disgruntled voters worry for jobs or worry about migration. They have to address that, and that brings huge swings in policies, and we cannot talk about strategies anymore. While I'm lucky to have the mandate in the part of Russia, which is 42% of Russia, about 9 million 8 million square kilometers with average population density of less than 1 person per square kilometer, which is Asia. We are Russian Asia. So when I go to Vladivostok, the region, the local sandbox is Tokyo, Seoul, and Beijing. It takes one and a half hour to Tokyo, 1.5 hours to Seoul, and 2 hours to Beijing from Vladivostok. And I think this...
to Moscow? How long to Moscow?
At 8.5 hours.
8.5 hours.
Yeah, so so we are much the Russian East, the Russian Far East is much more integrated, much more engaged with Asia than the whole country, and that's what we do specifically. We engage not only with China, with Japan, with Korea. You know, we held already 3 Eastern Economic Forums, which gather heads of states. This year we had Shinzo Abe, we had the President of Korea. So I think the short term is something that is a real problem. And trying to develop the Russian Far East, what came up to my mind, the mindset of Asian way of doing things. We can remember Deng Xiaoping speaking about the Taiwan issue. He said, this issue may not be resolved this generation, probably not next generation, but likely generation after that. And we all know he was not joking. And we all see things developing. When President Putin announced the development of the Far East as a national priority, he set out 21st century as a time frame because it is so huge, because the challenges and the opportunities are so big. So I think, and I'm happy to hear, first we heard several predicaments today, erosion of nation states, erosion of trust, erosion of international order, but later on we heard some remedies, like technology. And I have to tell you, even in my 16 years in private equity, what I saw as investment opportunities in the Far East at the start of my career in 2000, 2001, and today are completely different thanks to technology. And as Bill Gates used to say, we always overestimate the short-term impact of technology, but underestimate the long-term perspectives. And I think that is what is happening. You know, we all speak about China as a great economic power, great GDP. We rarely mention China as a champion of cashless payments. For instance, China, which invented paper money, the governor of People's Bank of China said on record last year, by 2026, China will get rid of paper money. So I think these are kind of beacons for us. These are kind of guiding principles and opportunities which help Russia to engage with Asia, and we try to build on a fairly new, Pacific-centered, technology-centered, cooperation-centered platform.
Yeah, this sounds, like this idea of making the leap and using technology, infrastructure. It's a sort of different form of globalization in a way to the one that was there before. The Gulf region in particular is putting a lot of, there's a big Riyadh conference, I think, going on tomorrow, you were mentioning a minute ago. Could you say something about whether you see those sort of, the remedy side, Middle East, a region riven by war, riven by conflict, is that the only way to see it, or do you think there are some real shoots of opportunity emerging here?
There are definitely shoots of opportunity. I mean, as we were discussing, part of it is the Middle East is so varied. So you have certain cities that are completely destroyed. We talk about Mosul, we talk about Raqqa, completely destroyed. And then there are cities that are emerging as cities of the future. And of course, Dubai is what comes to most people's minds. But there are other cities also on the cusp of modernity and actually leading the charge. And so it's exciting because you think those are the opportunities. Part of it has to do with leadership. And what is that leadership and how does it see the future? The UAE just announced cabinet changes where you suddenly have a minister of artificial intelligence. And it's a serious position because we're all talking about what's going to happen. Well, what's the regulation and so forth? That's exciting. But it is about globalization and partly regional dynamics. So in Saudi Arabia, you just had the Prime Minister of Iraq go to Saudi Arabia. You've had Saudi Arabia trying to put together this stronger Arab coalition together at a time when we thought regional cooperation was gone, impossible. And, of course, it's not all rosy, but it's important that you're seeing a reemergence of some sort of regional cooperation. That's vital for the future. The Riyadh conference you spoke about is this, incredible moment where Saudi Arabia is saying we're open for business and we're also open for change. And that's one of those moments that people think if the largest economy in the Arab world, but also one of the greatest influences of what happens in the Arab world, is ready to change. And some people will criticize certain moments and say, oh, we're already seeing some stumbling economically. Well, actually, no, it's not stumbling. It's saying when there is a problem, we're going to face it, and we're ready to change course, which is new. I mean, to actually admit when there are problems and say we're going to change course, we're open to investments, we're open to the world, we're going to have this major public investment fund conference happening in Riyadh where everybody from the head of SoftBank to magic director of the IMF is going to see what's at stake there. It's easy to lose perspective in the region and see only the conflict because millions of lives and livelihoods are destroyed. And I think it's wrong to underestimate that or the impact that's had. But at the same time, I think after at least 3-4 years of this war against ISIS and so forth, what's become really clear is that this really is a battle of ideas. And that contest of ideas, what can we live with, what can't we live with? And there are compromises being made. The hopes of 2011 where we saw, yes, of course, young people taking to the streets and talking about raising the ceiling and making public discourse about opportunity and what we can do. And then suddenly we were, of course, followed by internal strife and war and death. It's really hard now for people to come to grips of what does this region stand for? And it's a multitude of things. But one of them is the fact that it is opportunity. And I'm supposed to say this at the end of this because I know you're going to ask us about takeaways we've had from here. But I'm going to say
now.
it
I'll
here.
Forget later.
Because one of the takeaways from today was there was a session on the Middle East and can technology help with economies of the Middle East. And one of the speakers, Habib Haddad, said, I am optimistic. And even though it's easier to be from the region and say, actually, I have very little optimism, you have to be optimistic because you're from the region. And while we worry about a brain drain from there, actually, increasingly, people are going back and thinking, how can we remedy this and find a model that works for us? And that's partly learning from China and Russia and the United States and Europe and getting more to the local of what works for us locally.
Joe, just on, again, to follow this flow, but in Far Eastern Asia, really, this is where the second wave of sort of post-industrial growth really took place. A lot of people say that at the heart of that was education. And I'm just wondering, if you had to pick, and this is a place for sharing best practices, if you had to pick the 2 or 3 policy areas that made the most difference in order to enable the countries in Southeast Asia, China included, to really pick up and really accelerate growth over this latter part of the 20th century, early part of the 21st, and so far at least sustained it. In a way, we're seeing the Middle East, they want to imitate some of that. We could have a discussion about whether the education sector will be successful or not, who gets access to it. But if you had to pick the 2 or 3 things that really made the difference in your part of the world, what were they?
I think there are, of course, macroeconomic policies, but I think that in the larger scheme of things, providing regional stability compared to some other parts of the world, I think that has been quite critical. I think that China, which over the last, at least the last 2 decades, if not more, serving as the engine of growth. So Chinese policy, Deng Xiaoping's decision to focus on economic development, to focus on, they started off with manufacturing and now they're moving into the service sector, into a consumption-based economy. All these policies very strategically implemented. And in China's case, a readiness to learn, which is very different from the traditional Chinese, shall we say, response to developments outside of their borders. I think all this served to create that environment, obviously not just for China, but for the rest of the region as well.
And one of the lessons people have taken is that strong central government, not necessarily backed by elections, representative perhaps in other ways, or accountable perhaps in other ways, or perhaps not, is maybe the necessary way station. I mean, I've heard leaders from North Africa say this recently. If you look at the flow, even in Southeast Asia, Thailand, so instead the Philippines, Malaysia, there is a change. The kind of Western model of order as the way of getting there seems to be being questioned. Is that too big a statement to make or not?
What I would say is no one has the secret formula nor the monopoly over the model that would serve, that is foolproof. We have seen in recent years the problems, the very fundamental problems with the Western models, right? Which in the 90s was touted as end of history, and this was the wave of the future. No one talks about that anymore, least of all Europe and North America. On the other hand, you have Asian societies with their models. I think that they would be well advised not to gloat, because I think every model has to be suited to their particular context. Likewise, every model will have their weak spots, and the trick for governance is to identify and to deal with those weak spots before they become big problems.
So, Pavel, does that mean that as Europe looks outside to its region around it, which is one of the less stable parts of the world right now, we're talking about the Gulf, we're talking about the Levant, North Africa, parts of Eastern Europe, that it may need to not take one approach to them, that maybe it's going to have to be much more flexible, less conditional about its trade, about its aid? Do you sense that, I mean, you're at the heart of the long-term thinking of the European Union at the moment. Are you having to make some tough choices and decide that maybe the models of the past aren't going to be the models of the future?
I think we are inevitably heading in that direction, also because countries around Europe are making different choices. I mean, look at Turkey. 10 years ago, we would have perhaps hoped that Turkey would be far advanced on its path of accession. Well, it certainly doesn't look like it today. But what I think this discussion also means is that we are at this meeting point between technological change and geopolitics. Because, I mean, what really is happening in the United States, I think, among other things, is a reaction to the rise of China and to the rise of newly industrialized countries, because it's not just China but a few others, enabled by the liberalization of 89, 90, and that's when China and India really joined the world economy, but also by technological change, because with the ICT revolution, outsourcing becomes the norm, and with outsourcing, the higher value-added products and services can be done elsewhere. So that's really critical for what happened in the past 30 years, which Branko Milanovic summarizes in his famous elephant curve, showing that on the one hand, global inequality is falling, but inequalities within countries are rising, and it's the middle class in the advanced countries which is not benefiting, while middle class in the emerging countries, especially in China, is benefiting hugely. So part of, I think, what we're experiencing today is a reaction to that phenomenon.
And Alexei, then I'm going to come to you. So please get some thoughts, your takeaways from day one that you want to share with other people, or any questions or comments you'd like to share with the panel here. Please bring them up. Alexei, I think people in Western Europe, maybe some in the United States, have always thought, China and Russia are never going to be able to really get it together, because the population discrepancy, the size discrepancy is so huge that at some point there'll be a sort of geopolitical dimension to this. There'll be a dominance. Russia's going to have to keep China at arm's length to a certain extent. Is this a worry? Your responsibility from an investment standpoint covers a huge but quite underpopulated region next to a less huge and very highly populated region. How do we overcome that potential tension?
Look, frankly speaking, this is a question, it's not an economic question, it's a geopolitical and military question, and I think all those fears were, to better or to worse, resolved 50 years ago when we entered into nuclear era. So I don't think anybody sane could imagine military tension between such countries as Russia and China. However, I was the one who asked this morning before Foreign Secretary Johnson's speech why nobody was fearing nuclear conflict as such. Because a week ago I was in Seoul and there was nothing, no other talk than that. I saw two leaders of Korea, last economic forum and this economic forum in Vladivostok in September, addressing big crowds and with President Putin present and Prime Minister of Japan present, with only one idea: to help them, survive, to help them get through this problem. So the real tensions in the Pacific are elsewhere, then definitely not between Russia and China. And in economic terms, I think the giant shift that we're seeing in China's attitude is, for the first time ever, as far as I could say, and I'm sort of have been interested in China past 20 years, they are going into the world. The famous saying of Deng Xiaoping was, "Let's hide our brilliance." So they were happy having those dozens of thousands of factories already being a manufacturing base to the world, trading, but staying where they were. For the first time ever, Xi Jinping said, go west, young men. He really is urging Chinese system, Chinese businesses, state-owned enterprises, private companies, to engage with the world. I think this is a necessity. This is a necessity of excess capital. They have twice larger banking assets than the United States. And you're sitting on this money, it's like snow in April, it's melting. You have to invest it. Invest $33 trillion is a very difficult task. And also finding jobs for hundreds of millions of people who are constantly shifting between this, as Joe said, manufacturing sector, now service sector, agriculture goes into the cities, you build new cities, you don't need cities. So I think really what we're going to see is very interesting, because in spite of this very grand rhetorics about one belt, one road, there does not exist a plan as such, a strategy. There is no master plan somewhere hidden, secret. It's more an ideology. And it's going to be a learning curve for China, how to apply that.
It seems to me it's an ideology that really brings out the idea of a Eurasian century or space to compete with the American idea of a Pacific century, and we'll see if it plays out that way or not. So let's get some viewpoints in from around the room. Those who picked up ideas and so on, I'd love to hear them, share them. And please say who you are. I've got two questions right here in the middle. We've got another 22, 23 minutes, so we've got a bit of time here. Just introduce yourself.
Thank you. I'm the Bolivian ambassador. I have a question to you. If you see the Trans-Pacific Partnership has been a reaction to exclude China in a certain way. Today, China is going towards the Trans-Pacific Partnership and is going to enjoy. Why? Because the next generation of industrialization 2.0 is coming with robotics, and who is going to bring the shift is China, because China is going to bring. They have undertaken the industrialization, and of course all the developing countries, and of course East Asia, who has also had the 30 years of boom, is going to be affected. But who is going to win in this case is China. So I don't think that there is no idea of where they are going on. Perhaps you can focus, and you too. Thank you.
Please, yeah, let's get a few more points on the table.
Yes, Ramon Blequa, I'm the EU ambassador to Iraq. I would like to actually build on what Mina Rabi was saying on the developments coming from the region. Some good news, and not always the most critical conflict. And in the case of Iraq, when I have to say that 3 years ago, the talk was about the demise of the Iraqi state, the implosion of state institutions in the Middle East. And well, we have seen how recently the fight against Daesh is achieving a successful conclusion with the support of the global coalition and a remarkable unity of the international community, how the Iraqi state is running into new elections, and how it has managed to address the challenge of the Kurdish referendum in a way that has been quite impressive in terms of the lack of violence or the lack of fighting. Still, the situation is tense, but there are some silver linings in the way that this could be addressed. So in that sense, we have a democratic process going on. We have an economic reform program in which in the Kuwait conference, the focus is going to be basically on private investment and the role of private investment. And I think, well, I would like to ask you if that means the trends that we were considered so catastrophic in the region are also being reversed in some ways, and how those lessons could be maybe applied to in other places.
I mean, I can see a couple of big ideas sort of emerging from today. One is that we did hear from, I think it was MJ Akbar, who said that his big worry was whether the crisis was not about trust, but the crisis was about the future of the nation state. But actually, what I've been hearing through the course of the day is actually the nation states are quite resilient. We may have some concerns about them in parts of Western Europe, due to all sorts of stresses. Maybe we have the freedom to have that because of the EU and so on, but that they may prove quite resilient. So that's just one thought I want to put out there, because I've been trying to grapple with that particular one. And obviously we've had a lot of discussion about the role of private investment as a real catalyst of change, with the opportunities provided by infrastructure and technology as well. Any other points we want to bring in? A few more here. Please, yeah, in the front row here. I want to get maybe one or two more, and then, oh, sorry, and you, exactly, then we'll go there.
Hi there. So, quick question. We're talking about the use of technology and how the state can use technology in the coming 10, 15, 20 years. But what about the use of technology that is positive and growing, which is the use of technology from the grassroots, where people are using it for organizing, building new civil society structures? There's strength coming from the grassroots, and that would include entrepreneurialism. What is the role of the state to acknowledge that? Where does devolution come into it? And also, how much soft power is on offer then to the superpowers, or what was once called superpowers, to somehow work with that rather than against it?
Okay, let's take one more comment there. I think, yeah, the lights make it hard to see. Yep, there, please. And then we'll get, oh, sorry. I'll do the next round. Let me just get four in, then hold on to the microphone. Yep.
My name is Ahmed Hussein Adam. I'm from SOAS. My question is to Mina regarding the, how do you evaluate the position of the Trump administration vis-a-vis the Gulf crisis, the ongoing Gulf crisis? Because from what we see, from what you see is there is some sort of difference between the institutions such as the Defense Ministry and Foreign State Department, and then the White House? Or do you think that they are just playing game and playing both parties so that they can advance their strategic interest or something like that? This is my first question. Second question is the future of the GCC in the light of the current Gulf crisis. Thank you.
Yeah. So why don't we've got a number of points there. Future of GCC,
Iraq,
U.S. foreign policy, exactly. Have a go, a couple of those.
Sure. So I'm going to start with Iraq only because it's the closest subject to my heart, being from Iraq, but also because it really is phenomenal what's happened in Iraq. There is, again, there's a huge sense of loss, and I'm always worried about speaking about the positive and not acknowledging the very terrible things that have happened. And the areas that have been liberated from ISIS control need so much support, and there's so much building up to be done, but also the mental health crisis that we have in Iraq that in large part is being ignored from what happened. However, having said that, the amount of times people have declared the end of the state of Iraq, and yet the state continues, despite everybody and so many different people declaring its end. So I think that's really important. In addition to that, the role of the Iraqi army in the fight against ISIS and the fact that people now look at it as a national institution that they actually trust and applaud. And that was a very important moment. And again, it helped with the international community's support to it. So I think these are the sorts of trends that we have to keep in mind for Iraq. The Kurdistan referendum was ill-timed, ill-advised. Everybody on the international stage had urged the Kurdish leadership not to go ahead with this referendum. But now that it's happened again, the way that the Iraqi state is dealing with it is trying to find a solution. So this is a good news story to continue to follow. But as always, every few months we say this is a critical juncture for Iraq, and yet again we're at a critical juncture. The point about aid and not trade, or vice versa. Iraq for the longest time has just been waiting for aid. Now the dynamic is changing. It's about let's trade instead of just wait for aid, and that's why the conference in Kuwait will be so important. But also the opening of the land borders between Iraq and Jordan, having closed for 3.5 years, the opening of the land border between Saudi Arabia and Iraq after a quarter of a century of closure is significant because again, you've got the Baghdad International Exhibition is happening as we speak. And you had a huge Saudi delegation present there, but also other parts of the Arab world taking part. So I think the more we have trade rather than relying on aid, you'll see Iraq strengthen. And that is also a good news story to follow. I'll pick up very quickly on those, so I'll be very brief. On the GCC, we'll see, again, there was supposed to be the Kuwait summit in December. Most likely it will be postponed. It's one of those moments that I think goes back to this idea of the contest of ideas. And I think often there are details that we get lost in, but this really was about a moment of where the UAE, Saudi Arabia, Egypt, and Bahrain see how the region can go, whether it's about the role of religion and politics, or whether it's about supporting certain militias or not, and so forth, and where Qatar stands. So it's hugely important, I think, for how the GCC can remain together. But again, there are lots of ties that bind there. So I think, again, it's a bit too early to write it off. And we'll see how regional organization can work. That leads us to the United States. It's very hard to make a call on what's going on internally in the administration, but I think when it comes to Middle East policy, the fact that you have several people in the administration that were in the military and that were on the ground and realize, one, what's at stake, and two, see with clarity some of the nefarious activities of certain parties in the region means that they're able to call shots that weren't there with the previous administration. I think the weakening of the State Department is troublesome for the US, for the world, for the Middle East, and we hope that it can be strengthened. But I think in general there is a sense that the White House is calling the shots when it comes, and of course the National Security Council when it comes to certain Middle East policies.
Good. There were a number of other points. If you can pick them up, maybe actually starting with you, Joe, because there was a couple of questions about whether China was going to sort of
BRI.
take over the trade agenda and so on. Yeah.
Sure. Just very quickly on the TPP, I don't think it's quite accurate to say that it was designed to leave China out. In fact, the door was open to China and any other country that was prepared to meet the criteria. Of course, that's all moot now. But an interest, actually it's not moot. the TPP 11, hopefully will be able to go ahead. But an interesting point about China is that economic reformists in China were actually quite interested in the TPP in the context of the providing another rationale for the reform of the state-owned enterprises. If you remember, that was a time when Xi Jinping, as part of his anti-corruption agenda, was expressing a lot of concern about state-owned enterprises in China. And there was a thought that if China was to express interest in the TPP, that would force these state-owned enterprises to basically up their game, and there was interest in that regard. On the BRI, absolutely, there's no secret plan map that they can take out and implement. In fact, it is, to put it very simply, it is a high-risk, high-reward policy as far as the belt is concerned, across Eurasia. Because if you look at the map, geoeconomically, it runs through Central Asia, where a lot of the countries are not investment-grade countries. The risks of defaults are very high, and the Chinese are aware of that, and they are going to struggle with, on the one hand, trying to to provide assurances to private investors, to come on board, trying to provide assurances for their investments. But on the other hand, really risk exposure, exposing themselves to the kind of risk in these countries. You're talking about economic instability, you're talking about political instability, you're talking about conflict, ongoing conflict. So it looks good on paper, but that the belt is going to be very tricky, I think, for China.
Let me just give one question to you, the one on technology, Pavel, if I may quickly. The use of technology for grassroots organizations, civil society. We're sort of grappling between these big architectural questions in which the role of the state is so important, and then the much more bottom-up grassroots change that technology is enabling, business-led in many cases, or individual-led. Do you see Europe what does the European Commission think about this? What do European leaders think about this? Do they feel they're a moment of profound change they're going to have to adjust to? Or are they just trying to absorb this as sort of business as usual?
I think there is perfect understanding that our future prosperity entirely depends on our embrace of technology. This is frankly where China, it's not through the One Belt, One Road so much, because this is a classical infrastructure. But it's through the fact that China invests massively in AI. It leads in the production of electric vehicles. This BYD car, which maybe is not state-of-the-art in aesthetic terms, build your dreams, the abbreviation says a lot about itself. But this is, at the moment, ahead of Tesla, the biggest world producer. China's strength in solar panels, and I could continue. I think this is where we feel the competitive pressure, which is good, because we need to prop up our game in many ways. But I think this question about technology and democracy was very interesting, because sort of technology has in the past 2 decades been a lot about entertainment. And I think we are moving more and more to the paradigm in which technology serves a broader societal good. So it will be very apparent in education and health. But I think it will also be apparent in the way we run our democracies. I was in the session on cyber, and I was struck by how naive we have been about certain things, how exposed we have been and open. And this will change. I think this will change, but it cannot only change in a passive way, namely that we seal off the system and we make sure that no one can skew our elections. But it will need to happen in also an activist fashion, namely that people will need to, mainstream parties as well, will need to reinvent themselves and be much more present in where they're close to voters. So I think this will be an important change.
Okay, what we're going to do is we've only got about 6-7 minutes left. Last couple of comments, if anyone has any key takeaways from the sessions they were at during the day. You had sessions on Latin America, on Sub-Saharan Africa, obviously on technology and politics, a whole bunch of things. Let's get a few ideas, and then I'm going to go through each of you and get your key takeaway that you haven't yet mentioned. Some you've mentioned some already, and maybe something about kind of world order, which is important. I'll go first here, then I'm going to come there. Is there a microphone spare one here? So I run across the room. I know you have yours, sir.
Katarzyna Nawrot-Poznań, University of Economics, Poland. I was very much inspired by Alexei's comment on the proximity of far Russia and cities like Beijing, Tokyo, Seoul. And all from other session, my takeaway is the relation between state and non-state actors, especially megacities. So we see the changing dynamics between megacities and the states. And I think we really need to redefine the relations and maybe include in discussion on the world order the role in megacities. Thank you.
And you're right. As I said, we wanted to do that this year, but I think our timing, it is such an important issue that, as I said, Michael Bloomberg is doing a conference on this right now, which is interesting. Right, yeah, please.
Markentin, I would like to build a little bit as well on what was said by Alexei. So there are huge developments as far as Russian Far East is concerned, it's for sure. The region becomes more business-oriented.
Keep the microphone close to your mouth, please.
the region becomes more business-oriented and business-friendly. New pieces of legislation concerning territories of faster developments are enacted. Russian maritime ports develop as fast as Chinese economy, some of them due to a special status which is given to them, status of free ports. And it's a success, and there are ideas to give the same kind of status to northern maritime ports, to have northern maritime route fully operational in 7, 10, or 15 years. So there are ideas, and some of them are enacted as far as uniting energy system of Russia, China, South Korea, and Japan. Big companies, Russian big companies, enter at the same time new markets in China, in South Korea, in Japan, and so on. So it was said that China developed a new kind of ideology, economic belt of Silk Road. To match this new ideology, there is a new Russian-made ideology. It's a wholesome, greater Eurasian cooperation or project and so on. And it was developed by our expert society and transformed by the presidency of the country into concrete political, geopolitical initiative.
Good, and we can maybe come back. You might want to say something about Alexei at the end. There were a couple more, I think, Jeremy, and then that maybe, is that the last one? Yep, there.
Jeremy Greenstock, Gatehouse. Something that came out, Robin, of the international trade session, where we were talking about trade not being a problem, and promoting trade just increases economic activity, etc. It's the distribution of the benefits of trade that really matter. It leads me to think that in the period we're in of fragmentation, really, coming out of identity politics, everybody in each locality wants to be self-sufficient. But that self-sufficiency is becoming competitive because people don't understand the consequences, and at high level in Washington, the consequences of being entirely self-sufficient and therefore becoming competitive are not being realized. The answer, of course, is to do as much as possible collectively, to communicate and approach things collectively and see what the mutual interests are. Why is that fairly clear message not being understood by policymakers? Because this is not a zero-sum game. There is a collective interest in talking and seeing what can be done together to avoid self-sufficiency becoming a conflict.
Last comment there from Monica. There's one here in the red. Yep. Then we'll let you wrap up.
Thank you. Monica Machon. I went to the Latin America session, and I thought there were some really interesting points, including the diversity of the continent, which really made it difficult to capture a common political theme, if you will. But I was struck by how over the last 10 years or so, certain countries' middle classes have grown, which is a positive coming in the region. Countries like Brazil, Mexico, even Bolivia was discussed. And I'm wondering if there's some lessons in watching a rising middle class and then coming to a question of whether institutions can actually keep up with the expectations of that middle class. So I'll leave that as a point.
So we don't have to answer all of these points. These are really trying to get some takeaways that people have so you can talk about them over dinner and so on. I think this rising middle class point is a really important one, not least because that's been the story. Even if middle classes weren't rising in the West, at least they were rising globally, and eventually everyone would get a win-win out of it. But it strikes me, as a personal aside quickly as moderator though, a lot of these middle classes are extremely vulnerable to a negative turn in the opportunity. You look what's happened in Brazil. It had a middle class, then it didn't. You look what happened in Argentina before. It had, then it didn't. It could happen, and is happening in parts of Western Europe, in parts of the United States even. So the middle class is both the opportunity, but it could also be the risk if, as you said, the political institutions can't keep up in meeting the expectations. We had a big thing about expectations management. I think it was in the first panel or second panel today. So a chance just to some wrap-up thoughts, either a key takeaway, you can answer any of these points if you want, but a key takeaway, and whether you're optimistic or pessimistic about order. You're a pro. You can handle those two questions, Joe. Over to you in 1 minute each. You know, optimistic or pessimistic about order, and your main takeaway so far today.
On the takeaway part, I was in the trade panel. I was in the trade session as well. Basically, this globalization and international trade creates wealth. It does not promise to distribute that wealth, and it should not be expected to. Distribution of wealth is a governance and policy issue. Okay, so we shouldn't confuse the two. And the sooner the Trump administration realizes that, I think the better for them and for everyone. On order, my part of the world, I think I'm fairly optimistic. Because yes, there is some ambiguity or ambivalence with regard to the US, but what that has done is that has pushed regional states to look for alternatives which leads to a diversification of the various relationships, even as they deepen, and I think that's good. I think that's good, as opposed to putting all your eggs in one basket.
How about you, Pavel? 2 points.
I'm optimistic, but with two caveats. And one is about what type of society we will see emerging in the future, and the other one is about the socioeconomic model. So what I mean by type of society, I think we have a choice between a society which celebrates diversity and which runs a certain code of conduct of how to respect diversity, and a polarized society. And the jury is out which model will prevail. It's quite likely that we will be dynamically moving from one to the other. But this is the choice that needs to be made. And the second caveat is about the socioeconomic model, because people experience disruption. We discussed it during the day. Whether it's anchored in data or not doesn't matter so much, because that's what people feel. So there has to be a policy response, just as there was a policy response to the disruption of the 1930s in Europe, and it was powerful. There was welfare state, there was universal suffrage. For the moment, we don't have anything as powerful. We are doing incremental change. We are adjusting. The jury is out whether that will be enough to reinstate a new type of societal peace.
Alexei, a couple of last comments or your main takeaway from the day?
I am an optimist, as I'm not yet 40. And I think that as the generation shaped by Facebook will be taking over as leaders from the generation shaped by Cold War, we're going to see a lot of problems discussed today sort of resolved.
Cold War is the old generation, Facebook is the new. This sounds sort of optimistic. Discuss over dinner, definitely. Mina.
In the short term, I'm pessimistic, because I think this
Depends where you
lack
sit,
of
isn't it?
order.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I think the lack of order and trying to work it out means that a lot of people are losing out, and there are ingrained interests that are going to be fighting back. And there's, especially in our region, so much money and weapons around that people can physically be fighting, and it worries me that in other parts of the world you can see that. But in the long term, I am optimistic, because I think we are forging what will be a new order, and it's exciting to see and to report on that going forward.
Well, I'm a little older than 40. I'm still banking on the optimistic side, but I think that the danger is when you get overlaps of the negative close to the positive. I mean, this is where Europe, as a Europeanist, finds itself so difficult. It's trying to find the opportunities of the future, but is stuck next to a region that is still struggling, in particular through the difficulties. Sometimes Asia looks a little safer, but then we'll discuss some more, I'm sure, tomorrow, whether China can help carry the load that it has. Right, we're about 5 minutes, maybe even 7 minutes late, and we should have been for finishing. For those of you who are going to the dinner tonight, let me just say, there are coaches right at the front. Don't hang around. you know if you're going to the dinner, you were informed about it, there are staff at the end. Get on those coaches to go to the National Gallery. There's not much time to do anything between here and then, and drinks and so on will be available on the other side. If you're very much, I hope you are, coming tomorrow morning, so doors open at 8:15. 8:30, we have a series of breakfasts. First come, first served. Get your seat at the table. They're listed in the agenda. There's at least 4 breakfasts taking place over the course of the morning. If you just want to do bilaterals or sleep in a bit, you can. But there'll be some really interesting conversations led by colleagues of ours at Chatham House. I'd encourage you to sign up or turn up for them if you can. And keep answering those questions for my colleagues from the world today. But ahead of that, let me say a very big thank you to 4 panelists who had a big agenda to cover. I thought they did it very well, and some great comments as well. Strong hand, please.